Today we're going to be talking about Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 film Vertigo, as well as 1976 Brian De Palma's Obsession. I said the sentence, just not in the correct order.
Vertigo, a feeling of dizziness, a swimming in the head. Figuratively, a state in which all things seem to be engulfed in a whirlpool of terror, as created by Alfred Hitchcock in the story that gives new meaning to the word suspense.
1958's Vertigo was shot in VistaVision, which is, I think they did something where they turned it on the side, and it's almost a pre-IMAX. So this film looks gorgeous, especially in the 4K that they have on streaming, as well as the 4K disc. It is a very, very good looking picture, and the Technicolor is brilliantly used. So highly recommend seeing that in the highest capacity of visual quality that you are willing to see. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock, its screenplay was by Alec Cooper and Samuel Taylor, based off The Living and the Dead, 1954 French novel. Cinematography by Robert Burke, and music by Bernard Herman. It stars James Stewart, and Kim Novak. And why are we covering this movie? It's because this was in 12 Monkeys. So we spiraled here into the movie that influenced La Jetée, which influenced 12 Monkeys. So now we are here again, going back to the source movie. This movie was largely kind of not really noticed when it came out. A lot like Citizen Kane, years later people uncover movies and they're like, wow, this movie's fantastic. Recent movie Nightmare Alley was a remake of a film noir from the 1940s, and it came and went, and then years later it was rediscovered, and now people talk about it. So sometimes a movie needs a long time for people to really find its audience. I think Watchmen was a lot like that. That's finding its audience over the last 13 years, and I remember I was a big fan of that too. So this movie didn't do too well. A lot of that Hitchcock thinks was Jimmy Stewart, because he looked a little too old for the part. So his next movie, North by Northwest, he would use Cary Grant, who had a more youthful look. This would be his fourth and final collaboration with Jimmy Stewart. And then at this time, I think this is his last of his VistaVision films, because I believe MGM did North by Northwest and then Psycho, and then he remained at Universal for the rest of his career. So this was kind of a big moment for him. It's often considered one of his most personal films, because when you see the character, Jimmy Stewart has intense vertigo. You learn that very early on in the film. You see an accident. He sees an accident, which he could have prevented if he wasn't so afraid. Kim Novak plays the wife of a guy who hires Jimmy Stewart, and he needs to follow her. So it's your classic film noir plot in it's a color film noir. And he's following her through the city of San Francisco, follows her to a museum. You'll see a lot more echoings of that later in other movies. And Golden Gate Bridge, she tries to commit suicide, and while following her, he starts to fall in love with her. And then halfway through the movie, she goes to a bell tower, which you see echoed a lot later in movies. She goes to the top, but his vertigo prevents him from going because he's so terrified of the heights. So she dies, and then he has to get over it. And then he sees a woman that kind of looks like her, but different color hair, dressed differently. And then he starts talking to her, and then he becomes a little obsessed to the point of insanity. And then he makes her dye her hair, he recreates her, which almost they said Hitchcock was trying to do in every movie, because he always used blondes. He was trying to recreate someone. And a lot of people say you just make the same film over and over and over again. Hitchcock's film was always the wrong person, wrong man, was there. So it's like a why me situation. So when he discovers it's her, she reveals that it was part of a whole plot, basically for this guy to get rid of his wife. So he hired her so he could see that she died. It's a 1950s plot. You have to remember things are different, investigation plots, and the overall, like DNA, stuff like that. They're just like, okay, here's the money. But it's also a movie. You have to remember that. It is a movie. So all this leads to Jimmy Stewart once again bringing her back to the same place. And then they go onto the bell tower, and then she is scared by a nun. She falls off to her death, and Jimmy Stewart's obsession pretty much led to this woman's death. Had he just left her alone, probably wouldn't have been as bad. You see that echoed in Blowout a lot, if you remember from our first episode, wow, do you remember that first episode? Well, if you want to see it, we have a playlist somewhere in YouTube land. So between all these things, his obsession with trying to fix something that was out of his control, he just wanted to know why it was him, basically causes his unhappiness, and he loses the girl. She falls to her death, and he figures out the problem at the cost of someone else's life. Same case in point in Blowout, which is also directed by Brian De Palma, but we're not going to talk about Blowout. We're going to go a little further into another De Palma movie. Yay!
Yay!
De Palma was he took Hitchcock's style and he ran with it, similar to Dario Argento for Italian horror movies. So it's a style, and they've never been like, yes, we're inspired by him. Okay, what's wrong? He gave us in a completely different cinematic language. That's just my 2 cents that you probably don't care about. So, 1976, the movie's called Obsession. Oh, really? Wow, that's original. When I first saw it, was like, okay. And then they have a spiral logo 2 design. I think that was Arrow Films Blu-ray or DVD art, which, echoes it. This movie feels very much like Vertigo. It feels very, very similar, but it's not the same movie. And it's not a remake, but it's highly influenced by it. So Brian De Palma came up with the story, and Paul Schrader and him wrote. Brian De Palma and Paul Schrader wrote the story, and then Schrader kind of did the screenplay. And it was originally called Deja Vu. The only difference is it was going to be in 3 parts with a past, present, and then a future. And then De Palma decided to excise the 3rd act. As a result, they had a falling out and actually never worked together again. Paul Schrader, however, had done Taxi Driver with Martin Scorsese. He would later do, I call it Ambulance Driver, Bringing Out the Dead, as well as be a very successful director in his own right, and he's still around today. So, but just interesting in terms of collaborations. Our cinematography is by Vilmos Zsigmond, I believe that's how you say his name. He had done some fantastic films, including Macabre and Miss Miller, Blowout, and this beautiful movie, Obsession. This movie is like covered like in this foggy haze, and it's something his cinematography does, especially with Macabre and Mrs. Miller, or Mr. Miller. There's a right way to say that title, I'm sure my editor will fix it. It's like it has this haziness, but it has this almost, unrealistic quality to it. Like when you watch Hitchcock's movie, it feels like a 1950s film. Obsession feels like this dream-like, weird, like it feels otherworldly, and it takes place in the 70s, and the way it's soft lit, it's just a very, very, very pretty movie. Music also by Bernard Herrmann, so they have the collaborations. This is kind of the point of this episode. I want to talk about collaborations, right? It took me 5 to 10 minutes to get to it, but I got to it. Bernard Herrmann had done, I believe, 7 films from Trouble with Harry up until Marnie, and then he had done a what was it, the birds? He done a score for Torn Curtain, which Alfred Hitchcock rejected, and that ended their relationship. I feel music is one of the most important parts of film because it is sight and sound. It is not just an image. It is moving images with sound synchronized with music, etc. You use all these things to your arsenal. Bernard Herrmann, one of his best things, that very beautiful, and it just gets you into there. Along with Saul Bass's graphic title work, you're just like, this is it. Bernard Herrmann, when he came back, they actually used the temp score of Vertigo, and they said, he's like, turn it off! He's like, I can't hear that, because he didn't want to associate this movie, Vertigo, with Obsession. He wanted to do it. And he did this very epic, score, and it's absolutely beautiful. I think it's one of the my favorite scores, and Taxi Driver too. 2 very different scores by one of the masters in his, and those were his 2 last scores, I believe. Don't quote me on that. So I love that fact. But they shared collaborators, and then after this movie, 1976, he did Carrie with Pino Donaggio, who he liked from Don't Look Now, which has one of the most interesting sex scenes you'll ever see in film. I'm not even kidding. It is a very bizarre movie, but it's worth a watch if you want to give it a shot. So, but what we have here so we talked about Bernard Herrmann. We got Bernard Herrmann. We're done with this. We're going to move on to the actors. This stars Cliff Robertson, Genevieve Bujold, I believe I said her name wrong, and John Lithgow in his first of 3 De Palma movies in his De Palma trilogy. Now, if you remember, in episode 1, we covered Blowout, where John Lithgow's the bad guy. Surprise, surprise, he's the bad guy here again, this time with a southern accent, and oh, is he just nasty in this movie. This movie involves a very highly successful guy and a businessman. He's into real estate, and his partner, they're celebrating, and then one day he comes home and he finds that his wife and daughter are kidnapped, and then he calls an investigation, and then he listens to the guy versus giving him the money. Basically, he wants to give him the money, but the officer's like, I think we can do it without it. So he does it, and then it gets botched, and they're both killed, and he kind of has to live with that, and he's very upset. And then there's a time passage, and then all this land, he had this big land development, and he just doesn't do anything with it. And he put this big tombstone, and there's a passage of time. So that was in the past, and now we're in the present, which would be 1976. And then he's just depressed, and he's just hanging around, and then he sees a woman who looks strikingly like his wife, and he starts talking to her, and he's falling in love with her, similar to James Stewart in this. And then he eventually dreams he gets married to her, which he does not, because originally they were supposed to be married, and then the head of the studio said, yeah, that's not going to be in there. So it is now a dream sequence, even though it originally was part of the movie. They were supposed to be married, but they're not. I need to emphasize that they were not married, and they never did anything. So big part of the plot. Why don't you just tell us, Julian? So he goes, and then he thinks he's been betrayed and he's been set up, and then at the last moment, she reveals to him that, I was your daughter, and she thought he screwed up. The whole miscommunication thing, and this guy's whole life was ruined by his evil, nasty partner, John Lithgow, who wanted more money. Possibly, probably. But it's kind of like deja vu. The same situation happens to him. Now, Brian De Palma, this movie it's an interesting one because this came out before Carrie, and he wasn't, Brian De Palma. He was doing smaller movies, and Cliff Robertson gives interesting performance. Doesn't really seem like he wants to be here, and when you see some of the bonus features, especially from the movie De Palma, he really is he just didn't care. Steals the show, Genevieve, as well as John Lithgow. Every scene they're in, they really give it their all. And it's a very good movie. I'd say the weakest link is Cliff Robertson, unfortunately, due to whatever circumstances. But he's supposed to be tormented, but he just seems like he's not there. But that also could help the performance. Maybe it depends on how you're doing it. But this movie, I remember, was like, in his Brian De Palma's canon, it's largely like one of the lesser ones, even though it's not a bad movie, and it was successful. It just happened to come out the same year as Carrie, and it started that, he's a knockoff of Mr. Alfred Hitchcock, so he steals a lot, but then he's not stealing, he's homaging. So is it a ripoff or an homage? I will ask you. So we talked about collaborators and music this week, kind of, and how important it is. So what should we talk about next week? Next time on Picture Class, we'll be covering American Gigolo from 1980 and Thief from 1981. What do these films have in common? Well, the producer's the same. And from Paul Schrader's writing of The Obsession, we're going to take it to American Gigolo, where he both wrote and directed this movie. So Paul Schrader will be leading us into the next episode of Picture Class. I've been Julian. Oh my goodness. Julian at qualityattempted.com. Please like, share, subscribe. Find us on TikTok at qualityattempted. Find us on Instagram at qualityattempted. We have a SoundCloud and a Picture Class podcast coming up soon. A Picture Class podcast coming up soon.